On June 28, 1914, the Archduke, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was shot and killed in Sarajevo. His murderer, the 19-year-old Bosnian nationalist Gavrilo Princip, believed Bosnia should be part of a greater Slavic nation, not the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He would never have guessed that his act would ignite a chain reaction of alliances, invasions, and declarations of war, leading to the First World War. Before we dive deeper, take a second to subscribe. This helps us grow so we can bring you even more in-depth war stories and build a community of people who truly care about the history that shaped our world. In the summer of 1914, Europe was more connected than ever before, through trade, diplomacy, and royal bloodlines. But beneath that surface lay deep mistrust. Two powerful alliance systems divided the continent. The Triple Entente brought together France, Russia, and Britain, countries with different goals but a shared concern about German power. France wanted revenge for its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavic nations in the Balkans. Britain, proud of its navy and empire, feared Germany's rising influence. Opposing them stood the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Germany supported Austria-Hungary unconditionally. The two empires had military, political, and ethnic interests aligned. Italy was part of the alliance on paper, but its loyalty was uncertain. These alliances weren't just friendships. They were military commitments. If one nation was attacked, its allies would respond. The idea was to prevent war by promising massive retaliation, but it had the opposite effect. Any spark could set off a chain reaction, and the world would soon learn just how dangerous that web had become. On the morning of June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo with his wife Sophie. Waiting along the route was a group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists. Among them, Gavrilo Princip, just 19 years old, armed with a pistol and a cause. Princip believed Bosnia should not be ruled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Like many Slavs in the region, he dreamed of a united South Slavic nation, free from imperial control. He was a member of a radical group called the Black Hand, which supported violent resistance. The first assassination attempt that day failed, but by sheer chance, later that morning, the Archduke's car made a wrong turn and stopped right in front of Princip. 2 shots. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were killed instantly. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and responded with an ultimatum. 10 harsh demands, including allowing Austrian officials to investigate inside Serbia. It was designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted most of the terms, but refused the one that violated its sovereignty. That was enough. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war, and within days, the entire continent began to unravel. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. What followed was not a gradual slide into war, it was a collapse. Serbia called on Russia, its traditional protector. In response, Russia mobilized its massive army to deter Austria-Hungary and its powerful ally, Germany. Germany, now fearing encirclement by Russia in the east and France in the west, declared war on Russia on August 1st, and on France 2 days later. But Germany's plan to knock out France first required invading neutral Belgium. That would be a mistake. Britain had no obligation to fight for Serbia or even for France, but it had signed a treaty in 1839 guaranteeing Belgium's neutrality. When German troops crossed the border on August 4th, Britain responded with a declaration of war. In just 1 week, 5 major powers had entered the conflict, and still more were drawn in. The alliance system, once meant to keep peace, had become a trap. Each country followed its treaties like clockwork, believing it had no choice. Germany saw itself surrounded. Austria-Hungary wanted revenge. Russia claimed to defend its Slavic brothers. France remembered past humiliations. and Britain saw itself as the guardian of balance in Europe. None expected a long war. Most believed they'd be home by Christmas, but the machinery of war had been set in motion. National pride, rigid diplomacy, and military timetables had replaced reason. The spark from Sarajevo had ignited a continent-wide inferno, and the fire was spreading fast. What began as a European conflict didn't stay in Europe for long. The alliances and empires of 1914 stretched across the globe. And when their home countries went to war, their colonies followed. Britain and France called upon their overseas empires for troops and resources. Soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa were deployed to European battlefields thousands of miles from home. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, once seen as a declining power, joined the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary in late 1914. That opened up entirely new fronts in the Middle East. Fighting erupted in Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, and Palestine, drawing in Arab populations, Turkish forces, and colonial armies. Even Japan entered the war, siding with the Entente and quickly seizing German colonies in the Pacific and China. And far across the Atlantic, the United States remained officially neutral, for now, but the war was already global in scale. On land, sea, and even in the air, battles broke out from Africa to the Pacific. Merchant ships were sunk, trade routes disrupted, and civilians far from the front lines began to feel the war's impact. This wasn't just a conflict between nations, it was a struggle between empires. For many of the millions who fought, this wasn't their war, but they were called upon anyway. Young men from colonized nations were promised respect, freedom, or even independence in return for their loyalty. Most never received it. By the end of 1914, the Great War had swallowed entire continents. It was no longer just a European tragedy. It had become the First World War. Still watching? That means this story matters to you. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time to join our growing community. By late 1914, the war in the West had ground to a halt. Germany's attempt to quickly defeat France, the Schlieffen Plan, had failed. After the bloody Battle of the Marne, both sides dug in. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, nearly 800 kilometers of trenches carved up the continent. It was the beginning of trench warfare, a brutal, stagnant form of fighting that defined the Western Front. Soldiers lived for months, sometimes years, in narrow, muddy trenches infested with rats, lice, and disease. The space between opposing lines was known as no man's land, a killing zone littered with barbed wire, craters, and the remains of the fallen. When attacks came, they were often suicidal. Generals ordered mass infantry charges across open ground, straight into machine guns and artillery fire. Thousands could die in a single day for a few meters of mud. New weapons made it worse. Poison gas, flamethrowers, heavy artillery. Life in the trenches wasn't just dangerous, it was dehumanizing. Letters from the front describe endless rain, frozen feet, deafening shellfire, and the unbearable stench of death. Soldiers went in optimistic and came out shattered, if they came out at all. The Western Front became a symbol of industrialized war, high technology, low mobility, and unimaginable suffering. And through it all, the front barely moved. For years, young men died by the hundreds of thousands in a war of inches, while politicians and generals promised victory was just around the corner. While the Western Front was bogged down in trenches, the war in the East moved fast and hit hard. The Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, covering vast distances and brutal terrain. Unlike in the West, there were no continuous trenches. Armies clashed in open fields, forests, and frozen rivers. Germany and Austria-Hungary faced off against the massive Russian Empire. And at first, the Russians struck quickly, invading eastern Germany and parts of Austria. But they were poorly equipped and badly coordinated. In battles like Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, German forces under General Hindenburg crushed Russian armies, killing or capturing hundreds of thousands. Farther south, Austria-Hungary struggled against Serbia and later against an advancing Italy, who had switched sides to join the Entente. In 1915, the Central Powers opened a new front by encouraging the Ottoman Empire to attack Russia from the Caucasus. The conflict widened again. But the real breaking point came from within. Russia's economy collapsed under the weight of total war. Food shortages, corruption, and massive casualties fueled unrest at home. By 1917, revolution swept the country. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and within months, a new Bolshevik government took power. The Russian army disintegrated, and in early 1918, the new government signed a peace treaty with Germany, ending the war in the East. But the cost was enormous: the collapse of the Russian monarchy, the birth of Soviet communism, and the first of several empires that would not survive the war. On the Eastern Front, the war hadn't just redrawn borders, it had reshaped the future. At the start of the war, the United States chose neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson believed the war in Europe was not America's fight. Many Americans agreed. The country was diverse, full of recent immigrants from both Allied and Central Powers nations, and there was little appetite for foreign conflict. But neutrality did not mean isolation. The U.S. traded heavily with Britain and France, supplying food, weapons, and materials. Germany viewed this as support for their enemies. In response, Germany launched unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking ships around the British Isles, including neutral and civilian vessels. In May 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania, a British passenger liner, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. Public outrage followed, but Wilson still held back. Then, in early 1917, Germany pushed too far. First, they resumed full-scale submarine warfare. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico, proposing a military alliance if the U.S. joined the war. The British intercepted it and passed it on to Washington. That was the final straw. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. America mobilized quickly, with industry, money, and over 2 million fresh troops. The psychological impact was huge. For the Allies, it was a sign of hope. For Germany, it was the beginning of the end. Though American forces wouldn't play a major role in combat until 1918, their arrival shifted the balance. A conflict that had once been European, then global, was now truly universal. And with the U.S. involved, the final phase of the war had begun. By 1918, the war had raged for over 4 years. Millions were dead. Entire landscapes had been reduced to mud, wire, and bones. Germany launched one final offensive in the West, the Spring Offensive. With Russia out of the war, they moved hundreds of thousands of troops to the Western Front, hoping to win before American forces arrived in full strength. At first, the attack succeeded. German forces advanced further than they had in years, but the cost was devastating. The German army was exhausted, underfed, and losing morale. Then the tide turned. The Allies, now reinforced by American troops, launched the 100 Days Offensive. Town by town, trench by trench, they pushed the Germans back. Meanwhile, inside Germany, unrest was spreading. Strikes, protests, and mutinies erupted across the country. The people were starving. The Kaiser had lost the trust of his generals and the public. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. 2 days later, on November 11 at 11 a.m., an armistice was signed. The guns fell silent. After 1,564 days of war, it was finally over. Soldiers emerged from the trenches to shake hands. Civilians wept. Bells rang across Europe. But the world they returned to was not the same. 4 empires had collapsed, borders had shifted, millions of families had lost sons, brothers, and fathers. The war was over, but peace would be far more complicated. The First World War changed everything: borders, governments, and millions of lives. And though the guns fell silent in 1918, the echoes of that war still shape our world today. If you've made it this far, thank you. You're the kind of viewer who understands that history matters, not just for what happened, but for what it warns us about. So if you haven't already, subscribe and join our community.